Well, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you, Professor Moridasmo and Kevin Dacey for this excellent event. It's an honour for us to actually present to you and your and the distinguished guests. So over the next 45 minutes, I'm going to go into some detail with regards to the exposure drafts. So if we can just pull up the slides, please, that would be great. So next slide, please. So as Sue Lloyd had mentioned, the ISSB is seeking feedback on two proposed standards, a climate standard and a general requirement standard, over a 120-day consultation period ending on the 29th of July 2022. The proposed IFRS S1 general requirements for disclosure of sustainability-related financial information sets out the overall requirements for disclosing sustainability-related financial information about all its significant sustainability-related risks and opportunities to provide the market with a complete set of sustainability-related financial disclosures. The proposed standard also provides guidance on how to identify and develop appropriate disclosures about sustainability-related risks and opportunities not addressed by the IFRS Disclosure Standards Board, using disclosure topics in the ISSB standards and the CDSB framework application guidance for water and biodiversity-related disclosures. The proposed climate-related disclosures sets out the specific requirements for the identification, measurement, and disclosure of climate-related financial information. When an entity applying the IFRS S1 identifies climate-related risks as a matter to report on S2 specifics, the S2 specifies what to actually disclose. Next slide, please. So over the next few slides, I'm going to take you through the general requirements exposure draft. As Sue had mentioned, the general requirements exposure draft requires a company to provide material information on all significant sustainability related risks and opportunities necessary to assess enterprise value. Next slide, please. Information provided must enable the assessment of the effects of sustainability-related risks and opportunities on a company's enterprise value, which is the market value of its equity and net debt. It focuses on significant sustainability-related risks and opportunities and requires information that is material for a company that could reasonably be expected to influence the decisions that investors would make when assessing enterprise value. Next slide, please. As Sue had mentioned earlier, we very much build upon existing work, and the proposed general requirements sets out the core content, which is consistent with TCFD recommendations. And those four core contents are as follows: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. The governance sets out the governance processes, controls, and procedures a reporting entity uses to monitor sustainability-related risks and opportunities. The strategy core content pillar details how an entity's strategy addresses significant sustainability-related risks and opportunities. And then the risk management details how sustainability-related risks are identified, assessed, managed, and mitigated. And the metrics and targets details information used to manage and monitor the entity's performance in relation to sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Next slide, please. As Sue had mentioned, the IFRS Foundation was informed by its market engagement to build upon existing pieces of work rather than starting from a blank piece of paper. And the exposure draft very much illustrates this. So it builds upon the Climate Disclosure Standards Board and ISSB. And the general requirements does this as follows. So within the actual the exposure draft, it signposts to both of these bodies pieces of work, and it uses illustrative guidance booklet to illustrate the use of CDSB materials and SASB materials in lieu of a IFRS standard on water, biodiversity, or social matters, for example. The general requirements also builds upon the connected information and location of information built from CDSB's framework guiding principles, and uses SASB as and its classification system to support preparers on this journey. Next step, please. Next slide, please. Building upon the last slide, the general requirements proposed standard supports an entity in identifying sustainability related risks and opportunities and disclosures. Here, within the actual general requirements standard, a company would be required to disclose material information about all significant sustainability related risks and opportunities. If a company deemed climate to be a significant sustainability risk or opportunity, a company would apply the relevant IFRS sustainability disclosure standard to identify relevant disclosures. In lieu of a standard of a specific IFRS sustainability disclosure standards, when identifying sustainability related risks and opportunities and disclosures, an entity could consider the SASB standards, so the industry-based disclosure topics identified in the SASB standards, the CDSB framework and its associated CDSB application guidance on social, water and biodiversity related disclosures, other standards, provided that they are designed to meet the information needs of investors and other sources, so practices per peer companies in the same industry or geographies. As mentioned in the previous slide, we have developed an illustrative guidance booklet to illustrate how a company could use SASB standards and the CDSB framework application guidance. And this is to really encourage companies to act now in lieu of a specific IFRS sustainability disclosure standard. Next slide, please. Location. The sustainability related financial information will be required to be part of a company's general purpose financial reporting, but can be provided in various ways. So for those who are not aware, the general purpose financial reporting forms the same package of reporting that is targeted to investors and other providers of financial capital. So it encompasses, but is not restricted to, an entity's financial statements and sustainability related financial disclosures. It does not prescribe a specific location within the general purpose financial statements, so as to allow for jurisdictional nuances. The proposals allow for information required by an IFRS sustainability disclosure standard to be disclosed with information to meet other requirements, and it encourages the unnecessary duplication of common items. Next slide, please. Sustainability related financial disclosures would be required to be published at the same time as financial statements. The proposals do not mandate which entities will be required to disclose interim sustainability related financial information. However, jurisdictions may require an entity to publish interim reports. Next slide, please. Sustainability related financial disclosures shall be the same for the reporting entity as the general purpose financial statements. For example, if an entity is a group, the consolidated financial statements would be the parent and its subsidiaries, enabling investors to assess the enterprise value of the parent and its subsidiaries. The proposals Note that enterprise value is, however, affected by factors such as sustainability-related risks and opportunities arising from an entity's value chain and from investments in other entities that are not part of the consolidated group. The proposals require the disclosures of financial statements to which the sustainability-related financial disclosures relate with the same presentation currency as the financial statements. This is to encourage connectivity between both of these pieces of information, which I'll get onto in a moment. Next slide, please. Sustainability-related risks and opportunities across the value chain. The proposed standard requires disclosure of material information about sustainability-related risks and opportunities across its value chain. For example, the full range of activities, resources, and relationships related to an entity's reporting entity's business model and the external environment in which it operates. So this is operations with the company's within the company's operations, along a company's supply, marketing, and distribution channels, and the financing, geographical, and geopolitical and regulatory environments. A company would be required to use management in identifying material information related to activities, interactions, and relationships, and the use of resources across its value chain, determining whether it is relevant in assessing enterprise value by the investor. Next slide, please. It is proposed that companies provide information that allows investors to assess the connections between different sustainability-related risks and opportunities, and between sustainability-related financial information and information in the financial statements. When financial data and assumptions are used in sustainability-related financial disclosures, they shall be consistent with the corresponding information provided in the financial statements. And within the actual general requirements proposed standard, we provide some examples on what we mean by connected information. Next slide, please. The Foundation does not have a separate conceptual framework that applies directly to sustainability-related financial information. The proposals in the exposure draft include guidance on the qualitative characteristics of useful sustainability-related financial information, as set out in Appendix C of the proposed standard. This guidance is an integral part of the proposals. The characteristics are adopted from the conceptual framework for financial reporting issued by the IASB and are intended to ensure all reporting within the general purpose financial reporting, which includes but not limited to sustainability-related financial disclosures and financial statements, are decision useful for users and consistent too. It is also included to provide information to assist entities in the preparation of sustainability-related financial information. Next slide, please. As I've mentioned earlier, we have developed illustrative guidance in the form of a booklet, and the exposure draft includes that sheds some further light on this. This illustrates how to assess materiality and how to identify sustainability-related risks and opportunities and disclosures in the absence of a specific IFRS requirements. This guidance is illustrative and not mandatory, and very much is there to support companies on this journey. So that's the end of the general requirements. I'm now going to move into the climate exposure draft now. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. As my colleague Sue had mentioned, the climate exposure draft requires for the disclosure of material information about significant climate-related risks and opportunities. It incorporates the TCFD recommendations. Specifically, just like the general requirements, it looks at climate-related disclosures in relation to governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. It also incorporates specific cross-industry disclosures that builds on the TCFD cross-industry metrics that the TCFD had consulted upon, and other available guidance from TCFD, such as its transition plan disclosures. The SASB client-related industry-based requirements do form part of the exposure draft, included in Appendix B. Next slide, please. It also requires information that enables investors to determine the effects of client-related risks and opportunities on the company's enterprise value, understand the company's response to and the strategy for managing the client-related risks and opportunities, evaluate the ability of the company to adapt its planning, business model, and operations to client-related risks and opportunities. And it is also consistent with the general requirements exposure draft, which I've taken you through. Next slide, please. So for the next few slides, I'm just going to go into some more detail around the governance, risk management, strategy, and metrics and targets. So this slide focuses on the governance. So the proposed standard will require the disclosure of information about the governance processes, controls, and procedures the company uses to monitor and manage client-related risks and opportunities. The company would be required to disclose a description of the governance body, such as a board or committee, with the oversight of client-related risks and opportunities. Further details can be found within the actual exposure draft, but as mentioned a moment ago, it very much is consistent and builds upon the TCFD. Next slide, please. The next few slides, I'm just going to focus on strategy. There are quite a few slides on this. It's a very important facet of the proposed climate standard. The exposure draft strategy disclosure requirements includes 5 key areas that a company would be required to disclose information about. The significant client-related risks and opportunities, that is, that it reasonably expects could affect the business model, strategy, and cash flows, its access to finance, and the cost of capital over the short, medium, and long term. The effects of significant client-related risks and opportunities on its business model and value chain. The effects of client-related risks and opportunities on its strategy and decision-making, including its transition plans, as well as on its financial position, financial performance, and cash flows, and how client-related risks and opportunities are included in the entity's financial planning. And finally, the client resilience of its strategy, including its business model, to significant physical risks and significant transition risks. Next slide, please. The proposed standard would require companies to disclose information about how climate change could reasonably be expected to affect their business model, strategy, and cash flows, their access to finance, and cost of capital over the short, medium, and long term. A particular line of the company's business might be harmful to a company's reputation and could limit its ability to access financing. Here, a company would be required to identify physical risks and transition risks. Next slide, please. An entity shall disclose information that enables users of general purpose financial reporting to understand its assessment of current and anticipated effects of significant climate-related risks and opportunities on its business model. Specifically, an entity would disclose a description of the current and anticipated effects of client-related risks and opportunities on its value chain, and a description of whether its value chain significant climate-related risks and opportunities are concentrated. So, for example, the actual geographical areas, facilities, or types of assets, inputs, outputs, or distribution channels. Next slide, please. A company would be required to disclose its transition plans for responding to climate-related risks and opportunities. And this slide just details further examples of what we would be requiring an entity to disclose on this. Next slide, please. Also within the strategy section, an entity would disclose information with regards to its targets on these plans and the intended use of carbon offsets in achieving emission targets. And within the actual exposure draft, we go into some detail with regards to what an entity would disclose if they have been using carbon offsets to meet their emission targets. Next slide, please. A company will be required to disclose information on the effects of significant climate-related risks and opportunities on its financial position, financial performance, and cash flows for the reporting period, and the anticipated effects over the short, medium, and long term, including how climate-related risks and opportunities are included in the entity's financial planning. An entity shall disclose quantitative information unless it is unable to do so. If an entity is unable to provide quantitative information, it shall provide qualitative information. Next slide, please. The strategy section also goes into some detail around climate resilience. The proposal seeks to enable users to understand the resilience of the entity's strategy to climate-related changes, developments, or uncertainties, taking into consideration an entity's identified significant climate-related risks and opportunities and related uncertainties. The entity shall use climate-related scenario analysis to assess its climate resilience unless it is unable to do so. If unable to do so, an entity shall explain why and use an alternative method or technique to assess its climate resilience. An entity's analysis of climate resilience must enable users to understand the implications for its strategy, the significant areas of uncertainty covered in the analysis, and the entity's capacity to adjust or adapt to its strategy or business model over the short, medium, and long term to climate developments. Next slide, please. The proposed requirements state that if an entity is unable to do climate-related scenario analysis, then it can use an alternative method or technique to assess its climate resilience. These alternative requirements propose getting as close as possible to scenario analysis while being practical and meeting the market where it is today. So that's the end of the strategy section. Next slide, please. I'm now going to take you through risk management. The risk management disclosures follow the structure of the general requirements exposure draft, requiring information about the processes a company is using to manage risks and leverage opportunities associated with climate. A company would be required to explain the extent to which and how climate-related risks and opportunity are identified, assessed and managed, and how they're integrated in the company's overall risk management. This therefore builds on the TCFD recommendations, but extends the remit of disclosure to reflect both the view that risks and opportunities can relate to or result from the same source of uncertainty, as well as the evolution of common practice in risk management, while increasingly includes the opportunities and processes for identification, assessment, prioritization, and response. Next slide, please. This slide goes into some details around the metrics and targets. The objective of the climate-related financial disclosures on metrics and targets is to enable users of general purpose financial reporting to understand how an entity measures, monitors, and manages its significant climate-related risks and opportunities. These disclosures shall enable users to understand how the entity assesses its performance, including progress towards the targets it has. We do this as follows. there are cross-industry metric categories which were developed by TCFD, and we have included them within the proposed exposure draft, and they are detailed here, from greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, 2 and 3, all the way through to the remuneration, so the percentage of executive management remuneration recognised in the current period that is linked to climate related considerations. We also build in, as Sue had mentioned, the industry-based requirements. So in preparing these disclosures, an entity shall consider whether industry-based metrics associated with the disclosure topic, in this case climate, could be used in whole or part to meet the requirements. So the metrics and targets, in conclusion, covers both cross-industry metrics as well as industry-based metrics. Next slide, please. As I mentioned in my previous slide, the proposed standard would require an entity to disclose its absolute gross scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions and emission intensity for each scope. As Sue had mentioned, this is always tied back to what is material to investors when assessing enterprise value. And Sue had articulated a good example of when this would be necessary. And we would look out for, and this is information which would allow an investor to assess enterprise value. And this slide just goes into some details as to what we're looking for from a scope 1, 2 and 3 perspective. Next slide, please. As Sue had mentioned, we have internationalized the applicability of some of the ISSB industry-based metrics. Late last year, the Technical Readiness Working Group Climate Prototype, which was developed by ISSB, CDSB, ISSB, the World Economic Forum, TCFD, which was issued in November 2021, including 341 industry-based disclosure topics and associated performance metrics. And these were and these came from the ISSB standards. 11% of these metrics exhibited a regional bias that may inhibit application across jurisdictions. So during this period, and included within the actual climate exposure draft, is a revision to these metrics to internationalize them. And within this slide, you can detail what it was before and the actual proposed solution to internationalize 11% of these metrics. Next slide, please. In addition, we've also revised or included financed emissions. So no explicit GHG emissions disclosure topic and metrics and targets exist in the ISSB's financial sector industries, despite the need for industry-based disclosure. We've looked to actually address this by including financed emissions. So the proposal within the actual climate exposure draft includes transition risks in 4 out of 7 industries in the financial sector. And this slide just goes into slightly more detail as to what would be required by those by such entities within the finance sector. Next slide, please. This slide is very useful slide which provides an example of on the performance of a hypothetical company. So in this case, power company reported 45 million tons of CO2 for the year ended 2022. While the reduction of 40% from the prior year, this slightly exceeded power the power company's 2022 target of 43 million tons of CO2 equivalent due to the lower wind speeds of the year. In 2019, the power company signed a commitment to act to limit the increase of global temperatures to 1.5 Celsius and to become net zero across its entire value chain by 2050. Despite the 22 performance falling slightly short of the targeted emissions, the power company is still on track to meet its 2050 target, which is consistent with the Paris Agreement. Although the power company's direct and indirect emissions are not currently subject to the carbon pricing regulations, the company anticipates such regulations may emerge over the medium and long term. And this example is hopefully helpful for entities in detailing what a potential disclosure would look like when it came to metrics and targets. So this is the end of the my climate walkthrough, and hopefully you found it helpful. Next slide, please. Over the next few slides, I'm going to take you through the next steps, building upon what my colleague Sue had mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. As mentioned, we are running a 120-day consultation period, and over this period, we're going to be rolling out various different communication materials to support you in your engagement on this exercise. So there are two exposure drafts out. One is to do the general requirements exposure draft and the climate exposure draft. The general requirements covers a draft standard, a basis for conclusions, and an illustrative guidance booklet. And the same is applicable for the climate standard, where there's a slight nuance to the climate standard in that Appendix B includes the industry-based disclosure requirements. To complement these two exposure drafts, there are other materials as well. So a press release, a snapshot, a video, a comparison with the climate exposure draft and the TCFD recommendations. So really useful for those who have already embarked on disclosing TCFD disclosures, and a comparison between the technical readiness working group prototypes, which were released late last year, and the actual exposure drafts. I would suggest that a nice entry point is to actually pick up the snapshot, which provides a very high level summary of both of the exposure drafts before entering the exposure drafts themselves. Next slide, please. A call to action. So we're really eager to actually hear from you, your important stakeholders, and your feedback via the actual consultation process will allow us to actually embed some of your thoughts into the actual exposure drafts. So we really encourage you to actually engage with us on this process and respond to the ISSB's consultation and building capacity to engage in the ISSB's development of standards on an ongoing basis. Engage with relevant jurisdictional consultations where necessary, and sign up to our alerts. And there's a hyperlink here to allow you to do that. Next slide, please. So as Sue had mentioned, there are two ways in which you can interact with us and provide comments on the exposure drafts. So via online survey or comment letter. Both ask the same questions, so you just choose one which meets your needs, and we'll be reviewing your comments following the closure of the comment period on the 29th of July. Next slide, please. Here's a bit of a timeline on where we are and where we're going to. So on the 31st of March this year, we released those exposure drafts, so the general requirements and the proposed climate standard. And between April and July, there is a consultation. This is the consultation period, and us reaching out to yourselves and other international bodies. The consultation closes on the 29th of July, and I really do encourage you all to interact in this process. And between August and December, the ISSB will be reviewing the consultation feedback and doing an appropriate analysis. And off the back of that, there will be ISSB deliberations, and we will refine and finalize the standards based upon the consultation feedback analysis and those deliberations. And our intention is to issue standards by the end of this year, but this is really dependent upon feedback from the consultation. Next slide, please. As Sue had mentioned, there will be other technical priorities this year, such as the development of a taxonomy to facilitate electronic tagging and the presentation of disclosures. As mentioned, we will be consolidating the value reporting foundation by June of this year, and we will be improving the international applicability of the SASB standards. By June of this year, we will assume responsibility for the SASB standards on consolidation with the VRF. And our work plan going forward is for public consultation on the future agenda. So including sustainability related risks and opportunities, the ISSB should prioritise, and a delivery plan for the current SASB standards projects. So this is another opportunity for you to actually guide the ISSB's future work plan going forward. And I encourage you, when we release that future agenda consultation, to engage in that. And this is the next slide, please. And this is the final slide. So these are the various different ways in which you can interact with us, in addition to the actual comment letter itself. So my suggestion to yourself is to actually sign up to the IFRS newsletter. And if you're particularly interested in sustainability, just click sustainability and you'll be inundated on what we've been up to on a weekly basis. And there are various other means to actually learn about what we're up to as well, either via LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope you found this very useful. We're here to help, so do reach out. And now back over to yourself, Monica. Thank you ever so much.